Hey, folks. This week, the theme is scientific and quantified and moral eating. And the main point is to think about the rise of quantified dietary advice and how this fundamentally changes the way we think about diet and health. You've probably noticed up to this point, everything has been about balance, qualities, humors, everything has to be in proportion. Everyone has their own kind of unique combination of things. More recently, the texts we've been reading have been about blockages, keeping the juices flowing, so to speak, making sure digestion happens completely. So dyspepsia, indigestion, incomplete digestion means stuff is sitting around in your stomach, putrefying, creating disease. There hasn't been any math, no numbers, no measurement, nothing like that. But those days are over. We're looking at the 1850s, 1860s this week, and especially 1890s, early 1900s to see how we're starting to apply chemical research to foods. Chemistry really started to develop really quickly in the late 1700s through today, really. It was in the 1850s, 1860s when people first started, mostly in Germany, using chemical techniques, processes, ideas, equipment to study food, to think about what's in it, what are the chemical properties of food. So we read On the Properties of Foods by Galen, hot, cold, wet, dry. Now we're learning about different kind of chemicals, chemical compounds, macronutrients, carbohydrates, proteins. What is food made of? What does it do when it gets in the body? How do we tell what food is doing to our body inside of it? So we're starting to analyze all of these dietary questions in terms of chemistry. Really starts in the 1850s, 1860s, really goes fast. And by the 1890s, 1900s, this is just now the standard way of thinking about diet and health. Needless to say, this is a huge shift in thinking about nutrition and diet and dietary advice. We think in terms of the amount of protein we need, added sugars, calories per day. It just seems like the way the world is. And that's true. That's the world we live in. Every label gives you this quantified information. But we're really seeing the origins of that this week in the late 19th century. So very exciting week. Our readings also highlight links between emerging quantified health advice and moral advice. And I know what you're thinking, dude. We just looked at the coupling of dietary advice and moral advice. We saw a little bit in Cheney in the 1700s. We saw a lot in Graham in the 1800s, and even with the other random dietary manuals we looked at. So what's new? Well, now the ideas of social reform. So we talked about Graham as a social reformer, trying to get people to be more temperate in their diet, avoid alcohol, spice, and so on. Other social reformers in the early 20th century are now doing similar kinds of things, but in the language of science and quantification. So we saw Graham saying you shouldn't eat too much, right? Graham was giving qualitative advice. Temperance is good for the body, good for the soul. But now we have people, Wilbur Atwater is kind of our main example. We read about him Monday, Tuesday, and then we read his stuff on Wednesday. He says the proper amount of food is like 2,000 calories. So it's the same moral and health advice. Don't eat too much. The advice is the same, but there's a completely different way of getting people to follow that advice, right? You give them a number and say, we've measured what you need. This is the food that's going to give it to you. That's really different than anything Graham was doing, obviously, even though it's the same kind of advice at its core. Different way, totally different way of getting to the same behavior. For Monday, we're reading How the USDA Invented the American Eater. And three main points I want to highlight here. One, quantified dietary advice, quantified meaning numbers, measurement, so on, starts to equal dietary authority and expertise. From the early 1900s, as the article describes in a very nice, accessible way, the USDA built its dietary authority by using quantification. Calories, proteins, costs, right? You're supposed to buy cheap food. We still now expect food to be cheap, which is crazy because it's not cheap to make at all, but we expect it to be. And so this is defining what Americans should eat, right? It's being quantified, and that becomes the basis for how we assign dietary advice. Tools like the calorimeter start to quantify food as data. It becomes just a source of fuel, energy, and it promotes a kind of scientific eating. And we see this firsthand on Wednesday when we read Wilbur Atwater. We'll learn about him before we get to Wednesday, so you'll be well primed to appreciate what he's doing. But it's very clear that the idea of dietary advice is becoming your knowledge of quantified variables that go into diet. The second point worth highlighting on Monday is the idea that the USDA is using data to define what a good eater is, somebody who's rational, efficient, frugal, and follows the advice, right? The USDA has the pyramid, the plates, like whatever the medium is. There's official advice about what it means to be healthy and what you should be eating, and so on. Turns out the industry influence has been really dominant. This is never just about health, but the ideal eater could be characterized by age, sex, kind of work that they did, how much calories they expended to do their job, and then therefore easily governed by these different food guides. So the USDA, and this is happening in lots of different contexts, but in terms of diet and health, we have official government entities like the USDA turning actual people who ate actual food into statistics, just statistical objects, really, that are manageable, classifiable, and targetable by policy. This, you should eat this. You're gonna be healthy if you eat this. And these are all couched in the language of science, right? It's very rational, it's very measured, it's very supposedly objective. And we'll see how that's maybe not quite the case. The third point is that these USDA food guides, sort of as they progress throughout the century, but even the early ones in the early 1900s, the early official government advice strips away any kind of ethnic food culture and any kind of value to food outside of its use as fuel to produce work and supposedly to produce health. So immigrant diets get labeled as wasteful and unhealthy and un-American. So taste and appetite were treated as, irrational and un-American and therefore wrong, right? Buying something because it tastes good was stupid, right? You should buy the cheapest thing that gives you the calories and the nutrients you need to do your job, right? Otherwise, what are you doing? So important implications of quantifying food, right? Culture and taste kind of get marginalized, if not eliminated. We construct this ideal eater, right, who follows this advice and bases their decisions on what it means to be healthy, although that's defined by industry influence and lots of different competing research. And most importantly, you have a totally new way now in terms of quantification to establish dietary authority and expertise. Every red box on the syllabus so far says, tell me how the author establishes expertise. And now, starting in the mid 19th century, especially by the early 1900s, totally new way of establishing expertise. On Tuesday, building off of Monday's sort of exercise and thinking about quantification, Tuesday we really focus on morality and how it seems to infuse this supposedly objective approach to nutrition. And in fact, the author, Charlotte Biltikoff, she argues that the language of quantification is not just about creating more objectivity, but it's about rationalizing and normalizing and encoding moral behavior. And she makes a pretty strong argument that nutritional science doesn't just tell us what to eat, it tells us how to be good people. And dietary advice, in her mind, is always a form of moral education, shaping Americans' ideas about health, citizenship, virtue, and so on. Your assignment is a discussion board post to, argue with each other a little bit about how much do you agree with her. She's making a very strong argument that all dietary advice is necessarily moral advice as well. So I'm curious to hear what you think about that. A couple of points to highlight just from that day's reading. Firstly, nutrition as moral discourse. From the early 20th century onward, the author says nutrition science has encoded moral values into food advice, and it's done this in the scientific language that we read about on Monday. So eating right, always in quotation marks, means being disciplined, productive, rational, patriotic, and good eating becomes a moral and patriotic duty. That's what you're supposed to do. And that's why we see so many social reformers in the early 20th century telling people how to eat. And it's not just about their individual health, right? It's about our collective health as a country. Having this very rational scientific discourse about what to eat makes it much easier to promote assimilation of all the immigrants coming into the US and control them through scientifically framed food advice. You can make people more American by giving dietary advice that directly reflects American values, efficiency, economy, frugality. I've gone through these already. But it's couched in the supposedly objective language of science. So it doesn't sound like you're moralizing to these people. It doesn't sound like you're trying to convince them to change their culture. It sounds like you're trying to help them be healthier. But along with that, getting healthier, you're actually becoming more American, which is a big part of what these reformers were about. The second point for the Tuesday reading really parallels the second point for the Monday reading, which is to think about the social construction of an ideal eater. And so good eaters are constructed as middle class, self-regulating citizens. So you were a more responsible person if you kept yourself healthy. And the working class, the many immigrants, the poor, were often portrayed as unhealthy due to personal failure. And it's really in the early 20th century where we see a lot of this very, very strong rhetoric directed at the working classes for not making better dietary choices. And this was in the early 1900s, late 1800s. It's still happening when we talk about obesity and other health problems like that. We still ascribe the failure to make better choices, even though the science and the research has evolved so much, even since 1900. We know it's way more complicated than personal choice. We read a lot about this next week, the end of next week, so I'll save it for there. But this is where we start to see the origins of this. We blame the individual for being unhealthy. We don't blame structural inequalities. We don't blame working conditions that are way outside their control. We don't blame a lot of things. We blame the individuals because we think they could just make better choices. And in this way, food advice, dietary advice, helps inadvertently often reinforce different racial, gender, and class stereotypes. Certain people eat in a certain way because that's how they are, right? And that's actually not the case. So the third big point to keep in mind for Tuesday's reading is how nutritional advice can be used as a form of social governance. We talked a little bit about this for the Monday highlights, but institutions like schools, public schools, military, various public health programs of all kinds have official dietary advice. And this shapes people and who they are and what they value. It's not just about being healthy, but it's also about the individual choices you're making. The New England kitchen that we read about in the readings, I won't go into it in this overview, but you'll get enough detail in the readings. That advice they gave to immigrants about what you should eat just coincidentally was the middle class New England diet, right? Not because it was necessarily healthier, but because that's what they wanted people to eat. So nutrition advice becomes kind of a soft tool of power in a way, guiding behavior without overt coercion, right? So we want you to be healthy, so you should do X. But it's not the health that's necessarily the priority. It's the other stuff that's kind of underlying it. For Wednesday, we're reading another primary source that features very prominently in both readings. It's an article by a guy named Wilbur Atwater, who was one of the first, he's American, but he went to Germany to study with some of the people who were doing the first chemical research on food. And he brought that back and set up a laboratory and started training students to do that kind of work. He published this very important article in the Century magazine. I think it was called Century Illustrated magazine, really popular, nationally distributed magazine. A lot of people were reading this. You can Google Century Magazine and see what people were writing about and reading about. It's a really fascinating window into American culture. Anyway, Atwater publishes this article that introduces really technical nutrition terms to the American audience for the first time. Things like the calorie, which obviously we think, yeah, not technical term. But at the time, no one knew what this was. Proteins, carbohydrates, fats, this macronutrients, no one knew what any of this stuff was. He's trying to explain it in very accessible language, using a lot of analogies and metaphor to make it more comfortable for readers. And he's explaining chemistry, chemical processes, equipment, and how it's useful to study food. And he says this over, and it's okay if you don't understand because you don't understand how a train engine works, but you still ride the train and it's fine. So she's trying to get people comfortable with the idea that food chemistry is a really valid way of creating knowledge about food. People, the average person at the time was still going to be thinking in terms of balance and hot and cold, wet, dry. But he's trying to shift the mentality to think about this new scientific chemical approach to food. That's all about proteins and calories and so on. Seems common sense to us, but it had to start somewhere. And we're really looking at the origins of it here. Completely different way of establishing expertise. And Atwater makes it very clear in his piece. He doesn't say this directly, but if you read between the lines, it's clear he's saying if you don't know chemistry, you don't know what you're talking about in terms of diet and health. And to Atwater's mind, nutritional rationality was not only important for bodily health, but national health. We needed robust, healthy people who could work a lot, earn money, spend money, encourage the national economy. They could also be better soldiers when inevitably we would have to fight in some kind of war. The Great War, World War One, was just around the corner. They didn't know that, obviously. But this idea that conflict was going to happen and we needed robust people, not skinny, malnourished people. We needed efficient food to feed everybody equally well. Crucially, please notice what's not in Atwater. This is mentioned both in the Monday and Tuesday readings, but there's nothing about taste. There's nothing about comfort. There's nothing about culture, tradition, family bonds. There's nothing about the fun parts of food, right? For Atwater, food is fuel. That's it. Thursday and Friday, we slow down just a little bit. Those 2 days kind of get lumped together. So there's really nothing due on Thursday. There's just something due on Friday. It's the same kind of assignment you had last week with sources from the 1800s, but now we're doing it with sources from 1900s. So there's 3 texts on the syllabus. I want you to look at all 3. This is a triple point assignment. So it's a reading reflection, but it's 3 times as long, still not very long, 3 times as many points. So I'm expecting a little bit more detail from the readings than you normally have space to give in the reflections. It's a comparative reflections. Look at these texts, all dietary advice, early 20th century, but completely different in how they approach it. But there's a lot of underlying similarities as well. I'll have a hopefully short, probably not, a video that gives a little bit more context to the authors and who they are and why they're doing what they're doing, and a little bit of overview of the text, so that might help you a little bit. You can watch that if you think it's going to be useful, or you can just do the assignment. All the readings this week, Monday and Tuesday, the articles, and then Atwater Wednesday, and then the 3 texts for the Thursday, Friday set. I hope they illustrate nutritional advice is never neutral. We think of science as neutral, fine, but science doesn't do itself, right? Like people do it. And people are part of a larger culture and society that have particular values and ideas and preferences for what the world should be like and what people should be like, how they should act, what constitutes health. There's a lot of judgments, as I mentioned, I think the first video, there's a lot of judgments that go into translating nutritional, quantified, highly microscopic research into practical dietary advice, right? And those reflect much broader, not necessarily moral advice, but sort of other values that kind of get swept in and then couched in this language of science. Whether it's through quantification that we read about Monday, or whether it's through morality in dietary advice that we read about on Tuesday, there's often an element of social reform aimed at producing a particular kind of person, one who's measurable, one who's manageable, and one who's obedient to a particular kind of diet, to science in general, to cultural norms, to the state or official dietary advice. There's an element of control that is almost unavoidable when you're telling people what to eat, because we eat a lot, right? I mean, this is like ongoing. So when you're influencing that and those values and those choices, that's a big influence. And the language of quantification is really changing how this can happen. So this is a major shift in how moral advice that we've been reading about in different ways can be delivered. And now we can quantify it and we can wrap it in the language of science, which is meant to seem very objective. And it can steer us, our individual behaviors as consumers and citizens and eaters, in directions that in ways that we might not recognize. And we think we're following objective scientific advice, but we're also kind of following the values of whoever is giving that advice to us. So I hope this week helps bring into focus what we saw in the very first reading, also from Mudry, who wrote the article for Monday, about the language of science and the rhetoric of diet and health, how we talk about this stuff. There's no objective language we can use, right? The language itself shapes how we understand health. It doesn't just report on sort of this objective knowledge in the world, right? It's actively shaping the way we think about it. We're always choosing what to value. Calories, different kinds of nutrition, thinness, athleticism, longevity. There's all kinds of values that could be emphasized. And so I think when you read Atwater on Wednesday, and it seems very nice, seems very objective, scientific. He's trying to help you understand. But when you think about who is he talking to, who is he talking about, what does he want people to do, why does he want it a certain way, you start to realize that he's trying to get a certain group of people, like immigrants, to eat in a certain way, like New England middle-class Americans. And he's using the language of science to do it. And it's really effective. So I hope seeing what Atwater is doing with this historical distance, helps you think about how even our modern dietary advice and even modern cookbooks kind of might be getting you to try to eat in a certain way or, and adapt a certain view of health. It seems very benign. It seems like it's in our interest. Like we value our health, of course, we're going to do this. But there's also these other values that they may be creeping in as well. That's it for this week's overview. Next up is an intro to the three texts that you'll be looking at for Thursday and Friday this week, just a little bit more context about the authors and who they are and what the texts as a whole are trying to do. Hopefully, give you a little help in doing your comparison and contrast assignment later this week. See you in the next one.